An elderly black lady was ejected from the vehicle. 5 hours later, she owns the dealership. Elizabeth Johnson entered the business, the sleek dealership for glass panels with a blend of subdued enthusiasm. And this was more than simply another nostalgic errand or a spontaneous trip to Elizabeth. Entering that upscale dealership was the result of decades of difficult labor, sacrifice, and persistence. But just a few minutes later, she felt humiliated because she was brutally dismissed by the employees. Before we tell us where you are at the beginning of the narrative, observing from the comments section, and if you like stories like this, click subscribe immediately, then like and share video to people. At the age of 68, Elizabeth had lived her whole life, overcoming obstacles, one she defeated with grace and tenacity. Today was meant to be the day when everything from the time she entered. Nevertheless, the dealership's weight, the atmosphere, struck her like a chilly gust. Dazzling fluorescent lights that bounced off the gleaming exteriors of high-end vehicles. With careful attention to detail, the paint shines. The shiny flooring seemed as if they'd never seen a dust particle. It was a showroom intended to terrify a temple of riches where only the most privileged were. The air was thought to be worthy of reverence. As clear and still as the early sun shimmered from the gleaming glass walls of Crown Motors is among the most esteemed dealerships for premium cars in the city. Everything within glowed coldly. Business perfection. The subtle buzz of jazz music was playing softly in the background, mingling with the quiet muttering of a salesperson talking and taking precise measurements for the casual observer. The tone was allocation of elegance and exclusivity, playground for the wealthy and privileged, yet hidden behind the crown here. Motors has its own unwritten regulations. Initial perceptions were more important than if you didn't seem the role you were, classified and discarded right away, or disregarded. Have you ever encountered a circumstance in which you were incorrectly assessed according to the hue of your skin or your appearance? Tell us about your experiences in the leave a comment, and remember to subscribe to the channel to more appreciate this tale. Elizabeth's rich appearance. Customers moved through with ease. The room males spoke while wearing fitted clothes. Women and bespoke leather interiors wrapped in diamonds and high-end purses drank champagne, as salespeople cared for them as if they were each C client received royal treatment. The chairs with the most care were brought out, in order to enable them to relax. Offers of foreign premium wine and coffee were readily available. Additionally, no request was considered too shocking. In sharp contrast to Elizabeth got no similar greeting from the employees at she wasn't really seen by Crown Motors. As Elizabeth Johnson entered the smooth rotating doors and the soft sound of conversation of the salespeople halted for a bit, her presence was inconsistent with who they were. She wasn't what they had anticipated. To her understated but sophisticated ensemble, a beige blazer over top of a crisply ironed blouse and black pants didn't shout money to her. Used leather purse that she carried, crucial papers have outlived their usefulness. And in contrast to the wealthy client's being gazed on Elizabeth, who stood by herself holding her bag, calmly scanned the vehicles. Her eyes were perceptive, and there was a subtle yet an optimistic grin. Despite none of the staff seemed to be aware of or concerned about her, exited a little vehicle parked at she was carrying herself at the far end of the lot, an assurance that didn't need verification of the vehicle's on-show. Her gaze fell onto a sleek, silver fancy car, and briefly she pictured herself operating it alone. Did take notice of her despite Martha's youth, and an anxious junior worker is standing close by. Elizabeth was observed at the reception desk. Martha had been employed exclusively a few months at the dealership, and had already understood how things worked. Tom, the place was run like his by the sales manager. Clients of the personal kingdom who looked the rich, self-assured, and more white people were often considered, as anyone who didn't match that type was considered royalty. Martha ignored him, paused, and looked at Elizabeth, who had started to like a sleek silver luxury car close to the heart of something. Warm was there in the showroom, and sincere about the elderly lady that drew Martha in right away. But as much as she wanted to go up to her, Martha knew better, having seen what occurred to workers who disobeyed expectations, and as Martha had dreaded, Ton was on her way to Elizabeth already. His piercing eyes were fixed on her like Tom was a predator assessing its victim. Young, conceited, and well-groomed. His clothing, which was navy blue, was made to his slicked back hair and perfect shone brightly in the showroom lights, flourished on his inflated ego and authority, profiting from the endorsements of affluent clients and his employees' terror of Tom, the kind of guy who was the sales manager who took pleasure in making fun of other people to feel. He gave Elizabeth a once-over because he was strong. His slender, patronizing grin stood across the showroom next to the. He leaned idly against an entryway desk looking around the room. Smugly face as if he was the owner of the space at Rick, the general manager, was at his side. A guy in his middle years with graying temples with an unwavering grimace. Rick hardly ever smiled, and he smiled like that as he did it. It fell short of his eyes. Tom's as she walked in. Eyes fell on Elizabeth. He mumbled as he pushed Rick with his elbow. Loud enough for a few others to hear him whispering, their employees to learn that someone lost their grandmother, who seems to be in Rick, shook his head and laughed in the wrong place. His mind asks, what is she doing here? She seems to be here to purchase anything, most likely trying to get instructions. The other salespeople in the area traded delighted looks and silent laughs, but it was obvious that it was the type of laughing that was laced with contempt. It demonstrated that they had previously determined Elizabeth's identity before she even had an opportunity to talk. Were they right to evaluate Elizabeth based only on her look? Whether you think that they were incorrectly, just subscribe to the channel now. People who think it's appropriate to pass judgment unfairly, people will no longer subscribe. Ignoring their whispers. Elizabeth, choosing to ignore them, may have walked. Her eyes lighted up gently as she moved around the showroom, up as she marveled at the vehicles on exhibit. She was captured by a sleek red sports vehicle. Initially, she took a moment to focus on how its faultless light bounced off it. Her fingertips delicately scraped the paint, the side of a neighboring brochure stand, but she just took her without picking one up. Time spent studying when commuting between cars, each one with authentic. Thank you, Elizabeth. This wasn't just going to a car dealership. It was the occurrence that carried decades of individual importance at an early age. Elizabeth have a fondness for autos while growing up in a little neighborhood where she doesn't have a name. Dad had worked as a mechanic, and her garage served as a play area where I can still smell the engine oil, and her father's humming sound as he was employed under a beat-up. She'd been sitting on a car for hours, seeing her father's hands from a wooden bench revive. Engines that others had long-term abandonment. It was in the little garage where she first had feelings for the artist of vehicles. The freedom they had and the power they represented that he would inform her. Tales about the svelte luxury vehicles he'd seen in periodicals, always daydreaming about eventually possessing one. But at the time, owning a high-end vehicle had been only a dream that her family had little of, and all of her father's earnings went in the direction of keeping food on the table. But Elizabeth, even as a little child, had vowed to herself that eventually she will drive a vehicle that felt like if it were specifically designed for her. Elizabeth had passed on that dream, and throughout she had used it for years to build her life. Dream discreetly hidden inside her heart. She had put forth a lot of effort and sacrifice, sleeping through setbacks and creating, from the beginning until the present, the tech empire. Following years of unrelenting effort, she'd made the decision to reward herself at last. But Crown Motors employees were unable to view Elizabeth's story's layers. They just seen the surface, and they didn't value that surface. Tom approached her as he crossed the room, pulling at the corner of his lips with a sneer. He came up with the kind of self-assurance that verged on cockiness, his shiny sneakers tapping against the marble. Tom remarked, "Fleet, excuse me, man," as he spoke to Elizabeth in a kind but his eyes were tinted with contempt. Swiftly looked at her attire and his purse. "Have you already been judged? Are you lost? Can he assist you with anything?" Elizabeth turned. She smiled warmly at him. "Absolutely yes. I'd want to know more. From what I've heard about the new S-Class, fantastic aspects of its performance and security elements," she gestured. Her voice was directed at the silver sedan. Tong arched an eyebrow, cool and confident. Taking a quick look at the shabby leather bag, he repeated the S-Class on her shoulder. His tone is changing a little bit, which is, "What a vehicle. Are you certain you wouldn't? Would rather take a closer look at something?" He hesitated, trying to find the correct word. Elizabeth's grin wavered for practical reasons. The smallest instant. But she swiftly recovered. "No. I'm certain that I've completed my study. And this is the model that I'm most intrigued by." Tom cocked his head in, "Oh, I see." My grin is becoming bigger but colder. As if to make fun of her, he said, "One of our high-end models, it's quite. Are you certain that this is the automobile exclusive?" You nodded, showing interest in Elizabeth. She probably just forced a reply in response giggle while looking at Rick over his shoulder, who was observing remotely with emotion of bewilderment. "Is acceptable if you," Tom insisted, "but I should caution you, it's not very economical." Elizabeth's eyes became a little harder. "Even if she spoke calmly, I'd still, if it's okay with you, Tom, I'd want to see it." Folded his arms and remained still. His smile is growing. "Do you have a budget in mind, but automobiles such as this may cost up to 6 calculations. I don't want to spend your." Tom's eyes squinted a little and he giggled quietly. "But it's nice to have lofty goals," he continued, folding his arms. "But I believe you would discover what you are trying to find, our sister. The specialty of the dealership down the road in a more economical choices you could make if you were Elizabeth. Would you have left? What would you have done? The auto dealership, right now, or let us know when you're ready to battle prejudice in the comments and choose subscribe. Click now to show your support for Elizabeth." And Elizabeth's grin wavered throughout this narrative. Very little, but she kept her calmness. "I don't care about their inventory," she stated in a kind tone. "I came here to see this." Before Tom could answer, Rick the automobile. The general manager entered the discussion. Having gray hair, Rick was older than Tom. His hair had streaks and a persistent, with a frown imprinted on his face. He took satisfaction in on maintaining the dealership's picture unaltered, which often translated to rejecting those who didn't match his limited meaning of respectable customers. "What's happening here, Rick?" Gruff Tom grinned as he was questioned in his voice, pointed to Elizabeth, saying, He is intrigued by the Lux Silver class," replied, scarcely concealing his amusement. "Just guiding her in the proper way." Rick turned to look at Elizabeth. He murmured, his face stiffening, "Manum." To put it simply, this dealership sells only in luxury automobiles. If you don't really intend to buy, I advise you to save our time. Elizabeth's serene manner greeted his gaze. Unfazed, "I promise I'm being serious." "Look at us," she stated firmly, and Rick sneered. "Have actual clients to serve," he said, pointing to a couple nearby who were receiving champagne glasses. From Tom's evaluation of another salesperson is, true, you could feel better at ease. The couple, Rick and I, were at our used car dealership, mentioned a guy wearing a pricey, seeing a lady pouring in, and blazer. I looked at Elizabeth with my gold earrings. The woman's criticism was barely disguised, said in a whisper to the guy who grinned when he sipped his beverage. "A couple more employees are across the room." Members laughed quietly together, claiming to be occupied with other clients, but obviously taking pleasure in the Martha stood off to the side of the scene. Unlike her look was troubled. Co-workers, she didn't discover the circumstance. It seemed funny that there was anything about Elizabeth's serene dignity and her poise that didn't set well with Tom's manner, was taking care of her. But Martha was afraid to, "Don't speak out just yet." Elizabeth maintained her position and spoke steadily. However, there was a fresh edge to it. She responded, "I appreciate your compassion, but I would rather talk about the car's characteristics than." Tom opened his lips to respond, "Its price." However, before he could, Rick shouted from, "Don't squander too much, Tom," across the room. "Okay, I'm certain she would feel more cozy in the secondhand store down the street." There was silent laughing in the room, sound piercing the atmosphere like Elizabeth's shoulders stiffened as she held the knife. Her eyes were unwavering and steady, and she had dealt with individuals such as these in the past, those who made uninformed judgments on her who undervalued her because to her skin tone, age, or appearance, color. But she wasn't present today, terminated today, but in the meanwhile, she had a plan. Martha remained still close to the reception area, desk holding a clipboard in her hands. She wanted to intervene and say something. Fear wasn't the only thing holding her back. I've already seen Tom degrade someone, employee just last week for interrogation. His techniques caused Martha's heart to ache as she saw Elizabeth confront their obvious disrespect, but she was unable to locate the guts to portray Elizabeth, but she declined. I don't believe you should back down. Recognize the person you're speaking with. Shirik increased her voice, cool but forceful. A very dissatisfied eyebrow, and Hui inquired, what are we talking to exactly? Elizabeth smirked and chose not to respond. She extracted something from her purse. Her fingers worked quickly on her phone as she wrote a phrase in a message. Unreadable by the employees and clients, silently observed her, uncertain of what she was accomplishing. Anything that Rick and Tom were unaware of. Elizabeth Johnson wasn't just any client. She was a lady with built an empire throughout her life by remaining steadfast in the face of those who them, and she was going to remind them today, them why it was a mistake to underestimate her. Elizabeth stumbled after accidentally hitting send, returned her phone to her purse, but without. She looked at another word, returning to admire the silver sedan. A 7 if nothing had occurred. Martha gazed at her in wonder. A glimmer of hope ignited in her chest. She pondered for the first time if this lady, this cool-headed stranger, could be someone more stronger than she. The run seemed to be buzzing with anxiety, but Elizabeth was unfazed. She had already experienced worse than this, and she was convinced of one thing. The wheels had already started to move, but Tom wasn't the kind to conceal his opinions, and from his perspective, Elizabeth didn't be a part of this environment. Elizabeth departed from Tom's location and went to Her voice was calm and kind at the reception counter. When she spoke to the young employee, excuse me, behind the counter, she said, "You've got a model brochure and I want to look more closely at this portion. Examine before the receptionist has a chance to." Tom responded with a dripping tone. "We don't give out condescending advertisements promoting unrealistic automobile choices," he replied, his grin becoming wider. "Ma'am, don't squander each other's time." Elizabeth's words pierced like a dagger, but face didn't flinch. It stayed calm, even if his comment's sting was her eyes were clear. "And I'd still want to see a brochure," she said coolly. "I'm unsure whether it's your responsibility to determine what's." Tom laughed loudly, which seemed realistic to me. Sufficient for the other employees to hear some of them chuckle as well as their laughter reverberating through the showroom. Rick gave Tom a sign of approval. With his arms folded, he reclined back, leaning on a wall and observing the action. Just image getting made fun of. If want to purchase a product you can really be able to purchase, how would you, in response, press the subscribe button to continue? Elizabeth's kind smile in opposition to injustice diminished a little, yet her voice persisted stable. "Maybe I ought to talk to someone else, someone who understands how to handle prospective clients." With regard to Tom leaned forward a little and rolled his eyes. He knocked. "You've been waiting a long time." He smirked as he continued. "Time for that?" The employees surrounding him chuckled, once again. Encouraged by his conceit, the other clients in the showroom, wearing designer clothing and encased in wealth, took a quick look at the situation. Muttered to one another, their displays a combination of curiosity and judgment. There is a lady, holding a leather designer bag, gave a little shake of her head and whispered something to her partner. The guy next to her laughed while drinking, champagne-like if it were Elizabeth's. Therapy was a kind of amusement. Elizabeth maintained her poise, even if her fingers became a little tighter. Around her leather bag strap, she stood up, her tone forceful yet serene, and I'll wait, she murmured, her look simple. Stable as she gazed straight at Tom, "and we'll see how competent this is." Tom was raised in the business. Raising an eyebrow, she turned to face Rick. "I'm still here," he exaggerated. "Rick, do you want to put up with this frustration? Either this or should I contact Rick in security?" Smiling, he shrugged and kept his face. "You're doing great," he replied nonchalantly. "However, feel free to contact security. Don't want her to ruin the moment. Tom didn't spend any time on our actual clients. When he took out his phone, he made the caller's harsh, contemptuous voice. Yes, he answered. We have a situation here, smirking as he looks at Elizabeth. Someone is lingering in the can you send someone to the showroom to take care of? Elizabeth stood quietly. Her eyes were flaming, yet her attitude was serene. Martha the Junior, with silent determination staff member, observed from the corner of the room, each syllable lowering her heart. According to Tom, she has seen this kind of therapy before, but anything about Elizabeth's poise and grace made it possible. Much more agonizing to see Martha wanted to come out and tell. She remained anchored on something other than dread. She was just able to murmur. She apologized quietly beneath her breath, for one that Elizabeth probably didn't hear at all. A security guy came in a few minutes later. He was tall in the showroom, a guy with big shoulders and a non-nonsense manner, but as he got closer to Elizabeth, something about her caused his steps to slow down. Presence the subdued dignity with which he hesitated because of the way she held herself. Looked at Elizabeth. Ma'am. And then at T. With caution he replied, I've been requested to escort you out, claiming that you're disturbing the clients Elizabeth encountered, his eyes and her serene demeanor. But I'm not disturbing anybody, she said. Piercing said. I just want to see a brochure. The guard for the vehicles in this area moved uneasily, obviously sensing the situation's injustice, but Tom's impatient tone pierced the everyone's time is being wasted by tension. Sheck shouted, Just do your job, guard, paused for an additional time before moving aside and pointing to the door. I apologize, ma'am, he replied softly. But, Elizabeth, I must ask you to go, kept her dignity intact and offered him a little nod. Despite the embarrassment, I recognize that she whispered. She turned and approached the exit. Her back is steadied by her footsteps. She walked right by Martha. The young staffer said, I'm very sorry. Elizabeth gave her a little comforting pat, grinned but didn't say anything outside of, Elizabeth sat in her automobile at the dealership. Take a time to gather her thoughts. Her hands shook a little as she reached. She took her phone out of her backpack. The experience's weight pushed down on her, but she wouldn't let it to devour her. She had experienced more in her life, and she had no intention of allowing a group tough, haughty salespeople determine her value. Elizabeth started with composed resolve. Using her fingertips to type a string of messages went swiftly, the communications brief, but every SMS message was delivered to a key. Make touch with people who might comprehend the seriousness of what had just occurred and had the authority to take action regarding it as she sent the last message. She gave herself permission to no grin. The wheels had already started turning. What Rick and Tom were unaware of was that the source of Elizabeth Johnson's strength, from a lifetime of conquering challenges, growing up in the little garage owned by her father, she had discovered how to fight and dream big, difficult, and her silent outcome now would demonstrate more strength than their Elizabeth is sitting in her vehicle with prejudice. She had her phone on the dashboard. Keep your eyes steady. She wasn't only getting ready to her act two. The way they treated her, she was getting ready to instruct them in a lesson they would never forget. To hit the subscribe button. If you're enjoying the narrative, click the button now. In her automobile, Elizabeth sat with her hands steady as she browsed her phone. Her manner and face were composed, concentrated. She didn't give in. Resentment after everything. Instead, she had gone through. Elizabeth favored decisive action. She had been impactful and strategic. Embarrassed in that dealership, but she wasn't going anywhere. Still not resolved, she grabbed her phone, fingers moving quickly across the screen. Her first phone call was to Clara, her aide. Is it quick and effective? The lady who served as her right hand. Clara. Elizabeth said gently, Years, but I really need you to put me in touch with the Crown Motors Board of Directors. Inform them right now that Clara, it's vital, didn't inquire. She never did anything correctly. Away, Miss Johnson, she said before. She hung up, inhaled deeply, and the phone rung when I called her second number. A voice on the other end twice responded to the dealership's employees, didn't realize that the lady they just ridiculed was not just associated with the leadership of the organization. yet had the authority to shake its Elizabeth. The Foundation whispered quietly, describing every aspect of her encounter. Inside the showroom to a representative of the board of directors of the dealership, voice was forceful yet measured. Which isn't specifically about me, she said. This ice in the culture being fostered a tone of your most noticeable places if they handle potential in this manner. Clients, it says a lot about the leadership, or lack thereof, in this, the one on the other end of the dealership of the line paid close attention to their tone becomes more solemn with each word. I'll elevate this right now. Informed her that this conduct is unacceptable, and it will be dealt with. After thanking them, Elizabeth concluded without a second's hesitation, she sent text messages sent to other board members in succession, letting them know that she had an emergency. The texts were swiftly shifted by the fingertips. Succinct yet strong, she provided particular details that don't allow formless communication. But she wasn't finished, unlocked her contacts, and started contacting greetings to her business network. Connects with those who used Elizabeth's impact on the automotive industry, was aware that there was no change in a loan. It needed a group effort, endeavor as she wrote her parting note. She struck with a little grin on her lips. Send, put her phone down, and look stable. The wheels had already started to move, and there was no way to go back. Clara was the one who answered Elizabeth's phone. Miss, the board members are on the line. Johnson remarked. Good. To which Elizabeth answered. She spoke calmly, but she changed to steely. She opened her tone to the call. Guys, authoritative, I'm reaching out to you regarding. I recently dropped off one of your urgent dealerships, and I have to admit that the crew was enlightened by the event. The general manager is among those who have showed a degree of bigotry, and the lack of professionalism is inexcusable. For a business such as ours, Elizabeth described the event in detail, measured words without omitting any information. Voice remained constant. Yet there was an distinct emotional edge. I won't stand for this. She came to the conclusion that it's not. It's about the message, not just about myself. As a corporation, we take pride in ourselves on excellence, but excellence doesn't end with the item. It needs to extend to our treatment of each and every person who enters our doors. The members of the board exchanged quiet acknowledgments. We can deal with this. Richard reassured her right away that the message was brief but obvious. We must provide a model once again. Inside the dealership, leaned against the Rick and I were both giggling at the counter. They were enjoying their feeling of superiority. Wholly ignorant of the Elizabeth has started a storm. Rick slumped on his chair against the counter, well-tailored suit drinking he grinned at Tom, who was now drinking espresso, emulating Elizabeth's composed manner in an overly disparaging manner. I'd want to, Tom continued, his voice pouring. Look at this car. Honestly and sarcastically, the audacity of Rick laughed and shook his head at several individuals. I'm not sure where these individuals get the notion that they might enter here and act as if they can afford what Wessel, a white middle-aged male with graying hair wearing a great outfit navy suit, came up to the desk and inquired about a certain model right away. Tons. Naturally, his tone changed as he said, Sir, an excessively manicured grin allowed me to get the information for your waiting champagne. The guy gave a grateful nod and Tom suggested that Martha bring a glass. The newest employee at the dealership, Martha, her dark hair was nicely pulled back, and although her uniform was well ironed, her timidity stood in stark contrast to her audacious conceit. Co-workers observing the previous conversation, her stomach, between Elizabeth and Tom. Martha, twisted uneasily, stood beside Anne, comfortably fumbling with a pile of brochures, the image of which she was unable to remove. Elizabeth's calm but hurt Martha's face as she was humbled, understood that everything about it was incorrect. Yet, it seemed hard to speak out in an setting in which Rick and Tom's domination suppressed any feeling of, to be fair. Did you think she was sneering? Looking at Martha as she enters the room like, in fact, she could afford one of them. Some people's nerves. Rick shook his head and laughed. These folks enter believing they belong here. It's absurd, really. Our task is to eliminate them. We're the two. Guys are doing the corporation a favor. Once again chuckled, their voices carrying The other employees across the showroom, members either participated or stayed out of sight. Contact hesitant to contest their Martha, however, stood by the authority. The front desk couldn't remain quiet any longer. She had seen the whole encounter with Elizabeth, and Elizabeth wasn't comfortable with her being courteous at all times, but she was handled with such obvious disregard. Do you not believe that you are also taking this? At last, Martha murmured in a hushed voice, but firm, courteous, and didn't. Tom chuckled and said, "You deserve that treatment." Loud mocking noise that reverberated. "Oh, Martha, hurry up and cross the showroom. People like her should not be naive. Constantly squandering our time here in Martha. You'll learn about energy soon enough." Swallowed hard but refused to back down, saying, the lady wasn't impolite. She only wanted to examine a vehicle that she didn't deserve. When it was done, the room became quiet. Tom looked at her for a little period. His grin turned into a frown. "If you like her so much," he said sarcastically, "maybe you ought to go out with her," Rick said, giving Tom a back pat, being cautious, "Martha." He grinned and replied, "We wouldn't want to be fired because of anything," so Martha's cheeks reddened, but it's not insignificant that she held her ground. Said gently, showing regard for others, need to be mandatory. Tong rolled his. He waved her away, saying, "Why don't you concentrate on completing your work rather than worrying over unimportant stuff?" Martha bit her lip and he snapped at her, turned away, but the rebellious seed was planted. Was Martha correct for opposing their click here to subscribe to the channel? Prejudice. If you agree with Martha's behavior there was tension in Rick's showroom. When the phone buzzed, he took it out and looked at the screen. His informal manner changed right away. And the caller ID wasn't. He could disregard the number, which came from the dealership's main office. His self-assured smile at the corporate headquarters dimmed as he entered the rear office. Tom saw him go to answer the phone, casually resting against the counter. Tom questioned Martha, "What's up with him?" Who was occupied with brochure organization. "I don't." She kept her eyes down as she spoke. Despite her racing heart, she had seen the Rick's expression changed slightly before he left, but something was going on. Rick came back a little while later. He had beads of perspiration and a pallid face. Appearing on his forehead, he steered clear of the eye, made contact with Tom and said, "I must call again." Tom scowled. "What's?" Rick screamed. "Go on, just stay out here." His customary poise faltering, he vanished once more into the office. Martha closed the door behind him, observed from the showroom's corner. Feeling as if the tide was starting to change, he called, his voice not longer exuding a sense of Rick speaks with assurance. The voice on the other end, he said, was strong, piercing his conceit. Similar to, "We got a report about a knife from one of our largest stockholders with respect to the care they got at your dealership. Attention." To explain why Rick's face became white, stumbled, his normally fluid speech faltering. He answered, "I don't know what you mean. There must be some weekly miscommunication." "There isn't," misinterpreting the other person's voice, and snapped back, "We've been informed that a significant stockholder was made fun of and expelled from your dealership because of this behavior is not acceptable, and we require a prompt explanation." From Rick's lips closed and opened, yet no words were released. He was left standing when the line died. He turned there in startled silence to toned his face with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "We have a problem," he said. His low-pitched voice arched an eyebrow. Still unaware of how serious the circumstance, what kind of issue did he ask? Rick leaned forward casually, dropping his voice that goes beyond that woman's. "Anyone on the board simply gave me a call and they want explanations." Tom smirks, faltered but only briefly, waved his hand to wipe it off. He replied to calm down. "They're only attempting to." "Rick, what can she truly do to frighten us?" The first time he didn't reply, he discovered that they had undervalued. She was underestimated by Elizabeth gravely. Rick came out of the office with his reveal a shade of light. He muttered. Something to Tom's self-assured smile gradually dissolved into bewilderment and then panic. Then he frightfully informed Tom that the lady we expelled has ties to the board. Hold on. What are you saying? She's linked to the board, Tom inquired, about his voice rising as a significant stakeholder. Rick shouted, You moron. And the board's Elizabeth was presently sitting in her vehicle, engrossed observing the front doors of the dealership. Another message chimed on her phone. The issue they are on has been escalated by us. See that a little grin appeared on her lips, not of contentment but of determination. She was not yet finished. This was only the starting. The conflict at the dealership was evident, and clients started to take note. The nerve impulses emanating from the employees, as well as the always calm Tab, began to fidget, as Martha observed, her unease softly from her corner. Blending with a sliver of optimism, something significant was taking place, and she may see the haughty hierarchy that decided that the dealership may at last confront. Meanwhile, she's in her vehicle outside. Calculating. Elizabeth was notified once again. It was a response from one on her phone, of board members attesting to the fact that she read that prompt action will be done. The message attentively, her facial expressions serene yet. Resolve what Rick and Tom failed to cognize that their derision and their pride was going to cost them dearly. Elizabeth wasn't only a client. They had made fun of a powerful person to reveal their bias and bring concerning actual change. And she wasn't completed but returned to the dealership. The laughs had changed with the mood, had subsided and been replaced by a nervous. Martha saw the tension between Rick and Tom, gathered their self-assured fronts together. She was cracking, but she wasn't sure what was taking place, yet she sensed that Elizabeth was becoming motionless as the tides turned. As she sat in her vehicle, she took one more glance at the dealership prior to initiating the "she wasn't finished" by Longshot engine. This was only the first step, and she was resolved to see it through to completion. Elizabeth had experienced prejudice previously, but now she had their sources and the will to resist. The dealership's employees had no clue what was about to happen, but they were about to acquire knowledge they would never. I forgot that Elizabeth sat in the back, silently. The faint dangled from the seat of a beautiful black automobile, of the engine highlighting the acute attention in her eyes and her lengthy, serene manner. The storm that had been building was brewing after she took the vehicle out of the dealership, drove into the shiny parking lot. The harsh sunshine is reflected from the outside. It smoothly stopped just in front of the main entrance, causing them to turn around. Of employees and clients alike, the door opened, and Elizabeth came out carrying, with serene assurance, she had two people at her sides. Both board members were immaculately attired in customized outfits, and her legal advisor, a non-nonsense lady with a keen eye, required respect inside the dealership. The crowded showroom arrived at. Conversations came to a sudden stop. When people's gazes shifted to the glass doors, the employees' expressions froze in mid-task. Inscribed with bewilderment and doubt, General Manager Rick was the first to see the gang. Getting into his mouth clenched as he noticed Elizabeth Ton leisurely resting against a desk, tracked Rick's eye movements and straightened his face instantly, transitioning from self-satisfaction to a glimmer of, on the once certain air of the dealership, started to crumble under the might of the intimidating group. That Elizabeth came with a sense of silent authority. Her strides deliberate and discussed. The two board members followed her a little while, their stern faces looking around the room. The vitality changed noticeably. Even the customers sensed the tension while exchanging interested looks, while whispering to one other. Rick, he straightened his tie and hurried over to Elizabeth, had an odd grin on her face. "Oh, Mrs. Johnson," he shouted. Suddenly his voice was pouring with an unnatural sweetness. "Is a delightful sight. Once again, do allow me to personally help you in any way you need." Tom followed suit, abruptly giving up his sarcastic haughtiness. Had just several hours ago Mrs. Johnson welcomed me back. I hope you'll pardon me sooner. Misunderstanding led us to make sure this is the ideal time to visit. Elizabeth's serene, sharp eyes scanned. She first remained silent in the room, just allowing the stillness to endure for a long time, enough to cause Tom and Rick to wriggle. There was disdain and laughing, replayed in her mind, but she refused to let. Instead of letting her feelings show, she provided the little grin that didn't quite reach her eyes. Rick, in a frantic attempt to hide his previous actions, indicated, eagerly approaching the vehicles. "Please, take your time. I'd want to speak with you directly. Show you our newest champagne models. Coffee or anything else you need, just mention." The Tom added, his voice brimming with phony earnestness. "We want to make this have a remarkable experience for you deserve." The best after their abrupt fawning was nearly as funny as observing ineffectively practiced performers rush to repair a poorly executed performance. But Elizabeth didn't change. She didn't accept their pretended benevolence, nor did she react to their excessive. Nevertheless, her quiet had more impact, more than she could have said in words. How would you respond if you found yourself in Elizabeth's footwear and the individuals who mocked you before and are now displaying euphony, goodwill, and consideration? Since let us know if the tides of power altered. Additionally, remember to mention in the comments if you want to subscribe. Click the encourage Elizabeth and oppose prejudice. Elizabeth remained silent. Her serene eyes met Rick's right away, and she continued to look into his eyes. It seemed cozy. Then one of the board members interrupted him abruptly. "And we're here, authoritative, Mr. Rick Sanford, to respond to a formal grievance against the abuse of one of these most valued stockholders in the firm. Do you want to describe what transpired?" Rick blinked earlier afternoon. Briefly astounded the shareholder, he stuttered, the color fading from his cheeks. "Lack comprehension. You lack comprehension." Elizabeth's voice pierced the atmosphere. "You didn't even care to be quiet. Yet it was burning. 2. Pose even one query to me while I entered this dealership. But you assumed things and handled me with showing me such disrespect. Mr. Sford, is that your level of client service?" Tom, who had been standing a little behind Rick, attempted to regain his typical arrogant attitude. "This is most likely a misunderstanding." "Ma'am," he interrupted. We managed to chuckle nervously. "Hundreds of clients per week and errors do occur." Elizabeth's attention turned to T's serene face. "If you make a mistake, call someone who is making fun of you and saying, 'Are they also going to a used automobile lot?' Calling security on someone was a mistake, just because you have determined that they don't belong here and the room was quiet." Her remarks carried a lot of weight, and Rick tried to save the air. "Circumstance, we apologize, ma'am, for not recognize you," he murmured in a voice, become defensive. "If you just informed us." Elizabeth paused her tone to tell you, remaining serene yet with a hint of edge statement. "Immediately quiet him. I must declare my achievements or my ability to pay to get treated with Tom should not be moved from fundamental respect." Uncomfortably, his typical bluster has now not even the slightest hint of a client clearing their throat, and the only thing breaking the corner was the board members conversed in a tense hush, looks before one of them spoke. "Once again, Rick, this conduct is not just it's a straightforward but unprofessional transgression of this business's principles. We take great satisfaction in being inclusive and, as well as what we've heard today, respect profoundly." Rick's lips expanded and closed in discomfort. However, for once no words were said. Elizabeth remained quiet, his face pallid, pivoted slightly, her eyes settling on Martha, who stood close to the rear of her hands were clutched uncomfortably in the room. Martha, Elizabeth spoke in front of her, tone a little softer. "Would you be able to come?" Here Martha paused for a bit, glances flitting to Tan and Rick before she moved forward carefully and glanced at both, anxious, perplexed. Yet there is a glimmer of hope in her eyes at this early age. Elizabeth, the lady, started. Speaking to the board members were the only individuals who in this whole dealership showed me any compassion. She didn't chuckle today, didn't make fun of me or make me feel undesirable even if she didn't say anything. But her professionalism was apparent, even in Martha's cheeks reddened during her quiet, and she looked down, overcome by the Elizabeth continued, to pay attentively. Speaking to Tom and Rick, being a direct leader involves more than authority, as a matter of character. Leading by example, and based on both of you don't represent any of those attributes of a board member. Moved forward, his voice piercing through the strain given today's events. "We've determined that right away, Rick Sanford must take action, as of you are now released of your responsibilities. In General Manager T, your job with this. Additionally, the firm is being shut down with effect from The gasps that echoed instantly. Rick's voice could be heard throughout the room. Face became quite crimson, and he started to object, but the A board member signaled quiet with a raised hand. Your behavior against him has not only disregarded a significant stockholder, but furthermore put this dealership's repute. Such actions will not be. Elizabeth, who had been patient, turned back to Martha, who seemed utterly astounded by the events that are taking place. Martha, Elizabeth said politely that you are really professional today. Wasn't overlooked by this dealership need leadership that is representative of the principles upon which this business was founded, like to suggest you for the job. Martha, the temporary manager, widened her eyes, and she gave a little shake of her head as though she was shocked at who she was. Hearing me, but I am only able to. Elizabeth broke off a kind grin, adorning her face, demonstrating your ability, and that's what the board members care about. Agreed, and one of them took a step. Moving ahead, we'll speak with Martha personally. Make the required training arrangements and support, however, for the time being you'll enter their responsibility, and we have faith that you will manage it with you've already shown professionalism. Tears flooded Martha's eyes, and she nodded, speaking in a barely audible whisper, "Thank you, ma'am. I promise not to disappoint you." Customers and employees looked on in disbelief. Quiet as the events transpired, Rick and Ton froze in their conceit. Elizabeth turned one last time, broken. Respecting them isn't just for it's for everyone, anyone you think deserves it, and you now know the price of. She left without remembering it. Her head held high as she left the dealership. Silent power, making a lasting impression, stood still in front of everyone in the room. His thoughts in the midst of the dealership, he was reeling from his SMUD confidence, carried all day, was completely disappeared, supplanted by the stark, icy realization, knowing he had lost everything because of his behavior. The board member's remarks reverberated throughout, like an unrelenting drum pounding in his mind. Your job with this organization is terminated with immediate effect. Looked in Rick's direction, looking for any indication of camaraderie or support, but discovered Rick was a few paces away from his shoulders fell and his face became pale. Has been put on hold while a thorough inquiry and during his termination had not yet been decided. He may already feel the burden of its clicking the subscribe button is inevitable. If you think both of them earned their percussions of their behavior, the other employees stayed away from their looks that ranged from astonished to silently pleased that some of them had always despised Rick's and Tom's conceit. Blind reinforcement of his actions at this time. They saw the events of the fallout with amazement and vindication in combination, realizing that the system that had once permitted this kind of behavior was being disassembled in front of them. Elizabeth kept her eyes steady and controlled, piercing and steadfast as she stood at the air in the dealership's core waist tense, but she carried herself with the same silent power that had characterized her throughout the ordeal. She didn't take pride and rejoice. But this wasn't her win. It was a prerequisite for responsibility, and altered the board members took control of the circumstance, giving explicit instructions to the dealership's remaining employees were to be put under the policies. For urgent review would be training programs that are rewritten, would be put into practice, and Elizabeth herself would be crucial to changing the way the dealership operates. Her impact went beyond mere suggestion. It was an order from the highest authorities. Of the business outside, the once busy showroom's clientele got more affluent and silent, who had been given champagne earlier and given particular consideration now in a whisper among themselves, understanding that they had saw something far deeper, compared to a standard sales transaction. Felity they had quietly disapproved of and rejected had become a force of recognizing and altering their surroundings. They'd assumed that Elizabeth's eyes were always there, became softer when she faced Martha, who was still getting used to her surprising advancement to the position of intermanager. Martha Elizabeth spoke softly, her voice carrying, "This is just the unmistakable warmth that, starting with how you handled me today, shown bravery and integrity by using that same generosity to guide this group, to establish a setting where everyone feels valued no matter who they." Martha nodded, her eyes sparkling. "Thank you very much, Mrs. D. Johnson. I swear to do all in my power to create Elizabeth. You would be proud of this facility. Offered her a modest but sincere grin, saying, having previously shown pride, it's your time to demonstrate that leadership is not derived from authority that originates from the board's objective. Members are pleased with the instant steps taken, went outdoors. With Elizabeth will go on talking about plans, potential long-term modifications as they expressed the anxiety that had pervaded the dealership started to fade, and that was replaced by a feeling of potential. Elizabeth inhaled deeply. Her lungs were filled with clean air as she thought back on what had happened that day. Returned to the little garage where her passion for automobiles was first ignited, where her dad had instructed her in Therasilliance's worth and the significance of defending what was right in this isn't only about me, as she believed about all those who have ever been undervalued, disregarded, or treated disrespectfully. The goal is to ensure that no one else possesses to review my actions from today. With the final discussion with the board, Elizabeth turned in the direction of her ideal vehicle. A shiny high-end car that had captured her. As soon as she entered the dealership, the vehicle no longer seemed like a gift and more like a memorial to her, a sign her triumphant journey and her unwillingness to be characterized by the prejudice of others. She slipped the driver's door open. Her fists were grasping the seat as Shinjin and a sleek leather steering wheel purred to life. It sounds strong and reassuring while she changed the rear view. Her image in the mirror gazed back at her. Serene, powerful, and Elizabeth was determined and didn't simply win today. She opposed prejudice with power and grace. She changed it, turning a humiliating event into a motivating factor for change by providing a model that would reverberate much beyond that dealership, demonstrating that deference is a privilege, not a right, and that the real, refusing to accept, gives you strength, anything less if you were moved by this tale. Remember to press the like button, share your opinions, and sign up for more accounts of Justice's tenacity and tenacity. Together we can build a world with equality and love. I hope to see you at the next one.